Looks like we're live on YouTube now.
Okay. Let me just. Hi, everyone. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. Today we are here again for another session of the Slavery Archive book club. Today you are here to discuss the book Black Saints in Modern Global Catholicism. This is a book by Erin Rowe, who is an associate professor of history in the Department of History of Johns Hopkins University. Then Erin Rowe, she also, in addition to this book, she also co-edited a volume with Kimberly Lynn in honor to Richard Kagan. And this is a book titled The Early Modern Hispanic World, Transnational and Interdisciplinary Approach. This is a book co-edited in 2017. She also published another monograph, a previous monograph titled Saint and Nation, Santiago, Teresa of Avila, and Plural Identities in Early Modern Spain. And today, then, we are here to discuss this book. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. I am professor of history at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And I would like to introduce my co-hosts here, who are, let me just see if I can have everyone showing up here in the, okay, I am having trouble to put everybody, let's see, add the spotlight. Let me just put it here. Okay, I am not able to spotlight everyone, but I just want to call then my co-hosts, who are Alex Hill from Columbia University. And Alex, perhaps you can just show up while I am not able to spotlight your video. Also, Vanessa Holden, who is an assistant professor at University of Kentucky. And Jessica Marie Johnson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins University. Jessica, she is not around today, but she is always with us in spirit. You know that to organize this event, we need to spread the word then on social media, and we have been doing this for a while. Then for those of us who are on Zoom, I would just ask you to keep your mic mute. And what you are going to do is that once we start then the discussion, those who are on Zoom, you can always then use the chat if you have comments during the talk. And if you want then to have your questions asked then at the end of the presentation, then of course you are going to have a lot of time for discussion. Then we start this with a presentation that is then of about 15 minutes by Erin. After that, we move to questions and answers here on Zoom. You also, for those of you who are on YouTube, you can ask your questions in the chat, and we'll be taking your questions to the audience, and Erin will be answering those. Now, you just need to give me a moment in order to allow me then to change this. I have to add Erin here as to spotlight her video. Then add spotlight. Okay, I need your help, Alex, to do that. Okay, here you are. We are all here. I see everybody. Then now we have the the three of us. Then myself, Alex, and Vanessa, and you also have Erin. And now I will just then remove Erin.
on the side.
Now remove,
that.
okay, you remove yourself, okay, and I will remove myself. And now we have Erin, then you can start and present. And obviously, every time I have trouble with something, if it's not with YouTube, is with Zoom. Then thank you very much for being with us, Erin. And you have then the floor for about 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. I really am so grateful to you, Ana Lucia, and to Alex and Vanessa and Jessica for inviting me to participate in your book club, which is such a fantastic cycle of events that is been kind of, I think, keeping people going intellectually during this, you know, really complicated time. And it's so wonderful to watch everybody kind of come on board. And I have so many you know, good friends and people I've known for a long time who are showing up here today. And I just want to say in advance, thank you everyone who is coming to listen to my talk. I hope that for those of you who were able to read the book, that you know, found it interesting. And I'm really grateful for your presence and looking forward to our conversation. I am trying really hard to stick very firmly to 15 minutes because I know we have a lot to discuss. And I have some images to show you, but I'm only going to show a very small number because I find when I show images, I start talking about them. And when I start talking about them, then I go too long. So I'm trying to kind of keep it contained. And then if anybody has any questions about any of the images that I'm going to show you or from the book, we can talk about them. So because the book, for those of you who don't have it, has around 78 color plates in it. And so it's a very lavishly illustrated volume. It's a very visual project, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. So as you could probably tell from Ana Lucia reading the title of my first book, Saint and Nation, I'm a scholar of early modern religious culture and particularly of saints. So I'm always thinking about and with saints. And so when Black saints stumbled onto my radar, I immediately perked up my ears. And once I started paying attention to Black saints, I started seeing them everywhere on the landscape of early modern religious life and religious culture. But very few people had studied them or knew anything about them, about the saints, about when people started venerating them, and how and why they came to be where they are, both, and by where, I mean where they are geographically, the role that they have in Catholic devotions. So as I began to, you know, like a lot of projects, it started fairly small. Oh, I'm interested in this very, you know, 4 saints, basically. And then as I began to investigate, becomes the bigger and more complex the topic became. And so I started thinking about not just those questions I just mentioned about, you know, who these figures were historically and how they came to be objects of veneration, but the ways in which devotion to Black saints started circulating, because I noticed very quickly that you could find these cults in Spain, in Portugal, in Portuguese Atlantic Islands, in Luanda, in Brazil, everywhere in Spanish South America, in Mexico. And so I started thinking very spatially about them also. So how did this devotion circulate through all these sites from the Mediterranean to the Americas and across the Atlantic again? And so that led me, of course, to start really thinking about the intertwined histories of race and religion, of the slave trade and Catholicism on local and national and global scales. So the 4 main figures, part of the study, are all officially recognized holy people, meaning you know, if you go to the liturgy of the Catholic Church today, these saints are there. They're officially recognized. People of sub-Saharan African origin or descent. So when I say Black, I make that distinction because we can talk about this later if you'd like to. There's the phenomenon of the Black Madonna, which is a medieval phenomenon. And I was trying to kind of make the distinction between those 2 categories of saints. So the 4 figures that I'm studying are individuals of sub-Saharan African origin or descent. So we can divide them into 2 categories. The first category Elsaban, who were ancient royal Ethiopian saints. And Elsaban in particular, he has a cult in the Ethiopian church, in the Orthodox Church, as well as now the Catholic Church. So he is a figure with an established kind of cult in multiple kind of ecclesiastical contexts, and has since the 6th century. And then the other two are Benedict of Palermo and Antonio Donato, both of whom are 16th century Sicilian Franciscans. This is one of the interesting things about this project, that there were 4 saints and they were grouped so neatly in these pairs. But in spite of the different places and time periods that the individuals themselves originated from, they all emerged. Devotion to these individuals emerged during the same period. So in the late 16th and particularly in the early 17th century, we see the first explosion of devotion to these saints. In the book, however, in addition, it's organized around these 4 individuals, but I also spent some time talking about what we in the Catholic trade refer to as living saints. And a living saint is an individual who is recognized as holy during their lifetime, or sometimes after their death, but they never become saints. Their devotions usually stay local, and they don't really go anywhere in an institutional Catholic sense. But there were quite a number of living saints of color, particularly Black and in the Americas. And so I look at some of those individuals as well in the book. So not just people with official cults. Although one of the people that I study, who is an 18th century, late 17th century, 18th century West African woman who was enslaved and taken to Spain, where she became a nun, her name was Teresa Juliana de Santo Domingo. And she is now somewhere in the process of consideration for canonization. We'll see if that happens. So at any event, I have the saints as the center, kind of the anchoring force of the book, but also kind of thinking beyond that to the effect that having these Black saints as examples, as possibilities, might have helped open the door for living saints of color. So the chronology of the book stretches roughly from the late 15th century to the 18th century, but the heart of it is really the 17th and 18th century. Benedict of Palermo was beatified in 1743. And so that's a really nice, it's not exactly the end, but that's a nice time period to kind of anchor the end of it in, because that's really when devotion to Black saints reaches its height, because there's so much excitement building up to his beatification and following his beatification. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of this surviving images of Black saints, all of them, but especially Benedict, date from that period, the early to mid 18th century. So obviously, it's no coincidence that the church begins to promote Black saints during the acceleration and intensification of the transatlantic slave trade. So white clergy and their promotion of Black saints is a big part of this story. So it starts, we can say, with various individuals in the church with a whole array of agenda, but one of their main agenda was to figure out how to make kind of good Catholic subjects out of enslaved and free African and African descended people, not just in the Americas, but also in Spain and Portugal. But once I got into the archival material, those documents revealed that Black Iberian communities were at the heart of devotion to Black saints and the spread of their cults. So we see this devotion most visibly through Black confraternities. And a confraternity is a lay organization. So lay people got together in these groups that were, these were very common institutions in the early modern Catholic world. So lay people would get together and organize around a patron saint, and they would have, particular feast days that they would celebrate, and they would have an altar in a local church. And what we see happening is they were organized in a number of different ways. One of the things that emerges in the 15th century is confraternities that were specifically Black confraternities where we have a lot of evidence, we see a lot of evidence of devotion to Black saints kind of spreading. So in the project, I began kind of intellectually with Spain because that's my area of expertise. And at the beginning of the project, I wasn't sure what the geographic parameters would be. But then I kind of quickly realized that there were possibly a majority, yes, definitely a majority of images of Black saints in Iberia were in Portugal, actually, and not in Spain. So there are quite a number of Spain, but there are even more in Portugal. And so then I realized, okay, I need to start thinking about Portugal. I need to, more seriously. And I had actually never been to Portugal before. I started working on this project. So I started, my first forays into Portugal itself was looking for images of Black saints in Portuguese churches. And so I knew, of course, about the presence of Black saints in the Americas, particularly in Brazil, because there are so many, hundreds, if not thousands, of images of Black saints in South America, and most visibly in Brazil, where the Black confraternities were very strong and where devotion to Black saints among the Afro-Brazilian population remains really strong. So while I was thinking about, okay, from Spain to Portugal to the Americas, I've been trying to get a grasp on how to organize this project, how to understand the relationship between these places, and thinking about how devotions circulate globally. So I wanted to do that, but with simultaneously being aware that I was talking about these huge, rich, variable communities throughout, a huge swath of the globe, and that I wasn't going to be able to do that I wanted to kind of do all of the depth of research in every single one of these sites that I could, but I realized, okay, I can't do that. I have to step away from it. And I got most interested in trying to understand circulation and how circulation of devotion happens in the early modern period, and what it means, what that can tell us about early modern Catholicism, about Black Catholicism, about the sort of development of ideas, about discourses, about not just about race, but also about Blackness, and particularly this category of sacred Blackness, which was kind of a problem, basically a problem for early modern white clergy that they had to grapple with. And in some of the texts, you can kind of see them grappling with it. So, and the reason why it is a problem for them is because in Catholic understanding, saints are recognized as having lived without mortal sin. They can't be criticized, and they are owed veneration from every Catholic. So the elevation of a Black saint turned established social and spiritual hierarchies on their head, at least discursively, right, theologically. So Catholic authorities, as I've mentioned, eagerly encouraged devotion to Black saints as a way of ensuring or attempting to ensure proper Christian devotion and behavior by enslaved and free Africans. The clergy preached a vision of universal salvation that was threaded through with tension and ambivalence as priests sought to articulate Black holiness in a white supremacist context. So my interest in clerical constructions of Black sanctity didn't stem from a desire to present the clergy as anti-slavery. And there's a lot of talk about some of the figures that I analyze in the book as, sometimes along with the label of anti-slavery. And that was a label that I wasn't particularly comfortable with, because what I saw in my text was, everywhere this very deep ambivalence, even in works that were celebrating the lives of Black saints. There's a tension between deeply held theological beliefs and social political realities that shaped so those realities both shaped and were shaped by theology in really complicated ways. So, for example, all the white clerical authors that I analyzed stress the idea of redemptive suffering as a promise to enslaved Black people. That is, that their earthly suffering acted as a form of redemption in the hereafter. And some even refer to it as a form of martyrdom. So as a martyrdom, it requires endurance. And so that's the key thing about martyrdom, is the idea of acceptance. You don't fight against the injustice, right? So those were very old ideas, but they're mobilized toward an enslaved community. And as a result, in that context, they serve a very specific imperial and white supremacist function, right? So it's a very tense bringing together of these kind of complicated threads. And of course, this isn't the only time when we see these tensions arising in medieval and early modern Christianity, because when you have the idea of enduring earthly suffering and eternal reward, you create a system in which actually you can in some ways look the other way at the horrors of this life, of this world. Because if your emphasis is in what's in the other world, then you can say, okay, well, what's in this world is terrible, and it's always going to be terrible, and there's all this injustice, and there's all this misery, and there isn't anything we can do about that. But that's not going to exist in the next world, and let's focus on that. So it has the potential of creating a kind of casual attitude towards suffering that's horrific, right? And we could see that most obviously in the transatlantic slave trade, but also things, like the Inquisition and the promotion of various kinds of anti-Semitic and misogynist rhetoric and action, right? So while the priests that I work on, the clergy that I work on, sometimes spoke out against abuses against enslaved people, they did not explicitly speak out about slavery as an inherently unacceptable system. And that's one of the things that we have to watch them really carefully with kind of rhetoric they use. So you can critique abuse while still accepting the system, right? Which is what we see them doing. And also, a lot of the white clergy in the Spanish and Portuguese world were they were enslavers themselves and invested financially very heavily in human trafficking, both in West and Central Africa and in the Americas and in Iberia. So there are a lot of kind of complicated things going on here, where we have the reality of white supremacy and the abuses, and then we have the promotion and elevation of Black saints, both by Black communities and by white clergy, and this kind of interesting ways in which the church is trying to articulate a vision of Black sanctity for different audiences. And so one of the most significant sources for this project comes from visual evidence. And there's a lot about, because images are so central to Catholic spirituality, right? You don't have a devotion to a saint that doesn't involve an image, whether it is a painting or a sculpture or an engraving, it's always rooted in images. And so one of the things I found was sacred art played a fundamental role in devotion to Black saints, but it also played a fundamental role to my methodology, because it helped me sort of locate devotion to Black saints through surviving images. And some of them I know about from early modern texts, but I also know a lot about them from seeing them, from their continued presence in churches. And so in the book, my effort was to create a visual archive. And my ambition very early on was to have a comprehensive visual archive of all the kind of extant images of Black saints in Spain and Portugal. And even that relatively modest ambition was too big for the project. But I did find, several dozen, and I put as many of them as I could in the book so that everyone could see this sort of variety and diversity of the images. But one of the most important things about them is that they are in places, in the ones that I'm talking about in Spain and Portugal, are in places where the white Catholic communities around them that worship in those churches, they don't notice them. They don't have a relationship to those images, either devotionally or historically, and in fact, often even deny that those are Black saints in lots of different cases. It also allowed me to see beyond documentation where there might have been Black confraternities, and the ways in which Black confraternities included Black saints in their altars and in their devotions. And so it was always about thinking about these saints, what those images meant kind of artistically and theologically, and how that helps us understand the way the church kind of viewed these things in that way, and then what meaning they might have had to viewers. So I'm just going to show you these really quickly, and then we can talk about them if you want to talk about them more. Oh, my screen is failing to start. Did my screen share not work?
You should have access to it.
I do have access to it, but oh, here we go. Am I up now? Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so here we have, this is one of my, one of the images that I find the most powerful, and it's actually one that's relatively new in the United States. The Detroit Institute of Art purchased it a couple of years ago. It's a really magnificent image. All of these are the vast majority of images that I was looking at are 18th century and what we call polychrome sculpture. And all that means is painted. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about the blackness of these images and what it meant that they used certain kinds of pigments and represented Black bodies in very specific kinds of ways. So here you have the two Ethiopian royal saints. You can see the crowns at the bottom of by their feet, representing their kind of their abandonment of political authority for spiritual life. You have Elsaman there with his crozier on the back of this evil king that he defeated in battle. Here is another images of them, and I put the altarpiece that they're on in the middle, and I circled them so you could, because it's not easy to see, because everything is sort of gilt to the limit in this altarpiece. But this is in a Carmelite church, and there's a whole complicated program of Carmelite saints. And here we have these ancient Ethiopian saints right in the middle of it, of this beautiful altarpiece. And then this is a really important image of Benedict of Palermo that's in Valladolid in Spain, in their sculpture museum. And this is actually the image that's the cover of the book, but I wanted to give you a couple of different angles on that image. And I wanted to show you, I spent a lot of time in the book talking about their attributes, their iconography. And so it really matters what they're holding in their hands. And so here he's holding a piece of bread that's bleeding. And then here I wanted to show you, these are engravings, but it's connected to this constitution for a confraternity that's dedicated to Benedict. So they printed their constitutions and then included this engraving of the saint with it. So that's all I want to share with you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, thank you so much, Erin. And now then, let me just start asking you if you have any questions. There is a way for you by clicking on the button of the screen where it is indicated participants, and then raise your hand. This is the easiest way for us to identify who has a question, and then you turn on your video if you want. We prefer that you turn on your video. Who is going to start? Let's see who will be the first one to. Okay, let me just let me see here if I can. I see Tatiana, she has her hand. Then let me just put Tatiana here. Okay, nice to see you. Then go ahead and ask your question. Oh, you are muted. Okay, you are fine now.
First of all, I just wanted to say how much I love this book. I've been carrying it around with me and opening it and being astounded by the number of images, the quality, like the artistry of the photographs. And as somebody who loves to go to churches and just to look at the images as a complete atheist, and It's a very moving book. So thank you for writing it. I am always really fascinated by origin stories. And so you spoke a little bit about how they kind of came into your radar and you started to conceptualize a bigger and bigger projects. But I wondered if you could tell us like the initial story, like when you first decided that this was something that was going to kind of captivate your imagination for a whole monograph.
That's a great question. Thank you so much. It's great to see you, Tatiana. And I would like to say, just because Tatiana brought up the images, that the vast majority of those photos were taken by my father. And so this was a really familial labor of love going around from these churches. He's an amateur photographer. So he was kind of my sidekick on this trip. So that it is moving to me personally on that level also. But the origin story is a really interesting thing because it started, as I mentioned, with this very small kind of curiosity, really. I want to know more about X. But I have to say, it was probably the images themselves that really drew me in, that caught me and thought, okay, I have to keep going with this. And the ones that I saw first in Andalusia. And I thought, okay, well, these are magnificent. And then I thought, okay, how many can I find? How many can I see? And so for me, the visual component took up a huge amount of my kind of intellectual imagination in the project. And of course, like I'm also very interested because I've always worked on kind of theological discourses around sanctity. So then I was kind of like, okay, how do they talk about Blackness? How do they treat the idea of Blackness? Because I had worked a lot in my first book on femininity, and there's a lot of scholarship on female saints and the kind of ecclesiastical way of talking about it. Because you have to kind of justify it, right? Because women are seen as lesser. So then I thought, well, is it going to be similar? Are they going to use the same kinds of metaphors, same kinds of language? And so that ran in kind of parallel, where I was doing these really close readings of these hagiographies on one hand, and really captured by their metaphors, by their sort of rhetorical tricks that they were kind of trying to play, I think, in a way to bring their readers in. It was both of those.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Let's see if you have more questions. There are two here. Then I have Jean Ebrard. Jean, you are there. Then let me see. I added the spotlight. And here we go.
Okay, thank you. Erin, it's just to continue on what you were just saying. I want that you explain perhaps a little better than you told in your introduction why you choose illumination as the title of the second part of the book. And if I read well, what I read, you will tell me if I read well. What I read is that, in fact, you look at that in two ways. First, like you were saying just now, in the rhetorical discourse, which introduce an opposition between Blackness and not whiteness, but light. And I think that you could explain a little better why that is so important for you. And I would be happy to know if you connect that also with what you explained in the first part of this second part, which is the way in which the visual technicals and particularly what you call carnation are used in the same way. So to introduce an opposition not between black and white, but between black and light.
Yes, those are great questions. And I think actually when I first started thinking about this Blackness versus whiteness, there's a story in part of the hagiography of Teresa Juliana de Santo Domingo where they talk about her face turning white after death. And so there had been some analysis of that, talking about, that this was a typical opposition in early modern Christianity, but also kind of race making and whiteness being coded with Europeanness and your values. And I started thinking about what they were really saying, what the authors were intending and what they were really saying. And then I realized that there were a few cases where they used the word white. They were saying blanco or blanca. In the most cases, they were not. They were using the language of light. And so then I was like, okay, why are they using this language? And what does this language mean to them theologically? Well, and it's always been connected to the divine. And so this idea that actually what is inside every person is divine light. And so I thought it would be a more nuanced argument to say, okay, what they're positing is a kind of universal, like brightness of your soul. And so these things, they were not in opposition. So like if you're talking about whiteness and blackness, you're talking about things that we see in opposition. But I don't think that they saw the brightness that they talk about in the soul as being inherently in tension with the blackness in a racial sense of the saints themselves. And obviously that's a very complicated dance that they're doing because they both do and do not see it as an impediment. So I saw that language working differently in the text than I did in the images. So the incarnations that you mentioned, Jean, that's actually a technical term from early modern artists who are talking about the process of polychroming. That's the word they use, the encarnaciones. So that means applying flesh tone to sculpture, to painted sculpture. And so it both has like a technical resonance, but also the sense of embodiment and the fact that your bodies really matter actually in Catholic theology. It's not just your soul, but your body. And thinking about how that fits into their understanding and representation of Black saints, particularly in sculpture, which is all about the body. And then how, if they're thinking about likeness, why are they representing the body with this kind of monochromatic blackness, which is very different from the way they do the incarnations of white saints. And I argue that that's a deliberate choice. They're making a very specific choice to emphasize so profoundly the blackness of the bodies of these figures. But it creates a kind of that's not just where the theological meaning of the saints lies in their blackness, in their embodied blackness, but also their beauty, their grace, their sacredness. And I think they are intended to be beautiful, these images, and I think they are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. We have then Karen now. Let me just show her here. Okay. Whoops. Karen is there. Okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Karen.
Hi, hi, Erin.
Hi.
It's a delight to finally read the book. I've been reading it the last few weeks, along with Cord Whitaker's Black Metaphors, and also Larissa Brewer-Garcia's Beyond Babel. And I think Larissa's actually here right now. And one of the things I wanted to just, well, first I just wanted to say how refreshing it was to read both in your book and in Larissa's book, the attempt to get out the experience of Blackness from within Black communities rather than from outside, right? Which I thought both of you were really successful at that in really distinct ways, with a lot of interesting overlaps that were really fun. But the question that I have that comes out of my reading of all of these is whether so hagiography apart, so the saints apart, what's going on in theology in the 17th century in terms of thinking about Blackness and not sanctity, but well, from you, I know it's not conversion, but baptism and things like how is theology, how is doctrine dealing with these questions of the blackness of the outside and of the inside, and are you able to think about a distinct message that's coming out of the Black cofrades and people like that, as opposed to the doctrine? Are you seeing conversations there? I was just wondering about that tension.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Karen. Thank you for those great questions. So I think it's very difficult to begin with. I really wanted to be able to have better access, I guess, to how Black Catholics saw the images, how they understood them, how they incorporated those devotions into their practices. And of course, there's evidence for that, but there's less than, early modern people don't usually say, this is what I thought when I looked at this image, but they do say several times in different places, in different sites, so Spain and various places in the Americas, that they are devoted to Benedict because he's Black like they are. That sort of connectivity of recognition was something that was significant to them and their spiritual practice. I don't know, and I would be really interested to know if, to look at the commissioning of images, because by Black confraternities, because then you get a better sense of how they imagine the saints and how they're kind of thinking about Black sanctity, because otherwise it's hard to sort of differentiate how they think about that, as opposed to how they view the Virgin, for example, who is usually like the main patron of those confraternities. So theologically in the Catholic Church, it's kind of all over the place, like everybody in early modern Europe. You see the same things in theology I was going to say the same thing when we were thinking about all non-Europeans, but of course they're all different, but the same in the sense that, there's this ideal of universal salvation and universal mankind, and we all come from Adam and Eve, and Jesus died for all of us. And then of course, but we exist within this strict hierarchy, and it's good for me to enslave you or to not deprive you of your freedom so that I can create a Christian subject out of you. So, race making, I think, is always really deeply embedded in Catholic theology during this period. Is always going to be at the heart of it, even if some of them are kind of struggling with that morally, like that tension, it's still always going to be there. And so, they're talking, but there's a diversity. And that's one of the things that interested me so much, was thinking about, so you have individuals talking about the curse of Ham and using that as a theological justification for the enslavement of Black Africans specifically. And then you have other kinds of, referring to West Africans, for example, as pagans, as a way of kind of creating the sort of the discourse of the good pagan, which operates a little differently than the curse of Ham or whatever. So you have a variety of ways of developing different kind of theological views of the world, of dividing human beings, of understanding the relationship to each other on this horizontal axis. I'm not 100% sure that I answered both your questions. Okay.
Sorry. Okay, I have to unmute myself. Sorry, folks. I don't see anybody with who wants to ask a question. Then I will just go ahead and ask myself one question. Let me just see. Okay, I have two questions to Erin. then one of the questions is, because you have been talking about the sculptures, then mostly then these images that are three-dimensional. And in the book, there is this session on the printed images. And I would like to ask you in terms of, from the images that we have in the book, then these are engravings that look pretty much, how can I say, sophisticated representations of the saints and so on. But I would say that today, we, in places like Brazil, of course, we have all these very popular images that is still circulate with in color, images in color of these saints. Even for politicians in Brazil, when they are distributing their ads during the period of election, we call those santinhos, then little saints, because it's a reference to this kind of image. And I would like to ask you then, at which point, when exactly these images that are printed, they become like much more widespread, because this seems, of course, to be a much easier way to circulate these images, to make these saints, these Black saints, global. Now, the other question that perhaps is also related to the work of Tatiana and so on, is that you have this global in the title. And people, when you are using the global, they are always saying, oh, but what about Asia? What about these other places? Then we have some of these, then these Iberian kingdoms, then Portugal in particular, then present in Asia. I ask myself, what about the circulation of these images of the saints and their devotion in Asia, and then back to Africa? Because some of them, they are African saints that at least their imagined story. I think about Saint Iphigenia, for example. But how do they come back? Do they come back to Africa? And if you would have any stories or any elements to add to this.
Yeah, so those are both great questions. And I'll just say, at first, when I was thinking about what I was talking, when I like the phrase global Catholicism, it was a way about rethinking dynamics. So there had been, I mean, most of us are probably familiar with this kind of language of, Europeans went out and converted people, and, Catholicism as being a very kind of unidirectional process, and that you might have specific devotional lives that take place that are local, but that's it. They're sort of like the circulating Christianity, which comes from the church, and then there's kind of local specific variations of it, or reactions or resistance to missionary efforts. And I started thinking about, well, is that the only way to imagine the movement of devotional thought? And so when I was part of what I was investing in that term was a way of thinking, right? Rather than the actual, like, covering the actual globe, but a way of kind of inspiring people to think differently about those dynamics. Can we talk about Catholicism during this period in a way that decenters Rome, that thinks about the ways in which Europeans are affected by devotional practices that are happening in the Americas, in Central Africa, in South Asia? And so for me, it was more about that. So thinking about the kind of Pacific element is complicated. I don't know very much about the spread of devotion to Black saints outside of the Americas. I'm not even 100% sure about the Philippines. And so I don't know if there was any in the early modern period, if there is any today. I know from textual sources that there were at least several images of Benedict of Palermo in Angola in the early modern period. So they talk about Black confraternities in Luanda and further inland, and then a couple of specific references to Benedict of Palermo. So we know that those images were there, and that cult was there. I will say, as like a side note, I think I mentioned him really briefly, but somebody I'm really interested in is this, I don't know if you guys know about him, this South Asian Portuguese Franciscan named Gonzalo Garcia, who becomes a Franciscan. He's a South Asian mother and a Portuguese father. He becomes a Franciscan in the late 16th century, and he is on his way somewhere and gets shipwrecked and ends up in Japan, right at the time when the Christians are being rounded up by the Japanese authorities, and he becomes a martyr. And he becomes part of the martyrs of Nagasaki and gets kind of like a cult, a devotional cult. And then he shows up in Brazil and Portugal as a patron saint of Black confraternities. And so that is like an interesting kind of Pacific circulation in a slightly different context. But it's kind of interesting to think about, what Blackness means in that context.
Thank you so much. I have a question. Then there are two people who have questions here. I don't know if you have any questions on YouTube, but there is one that perhaps is connected to what you are already talking about. That is from Elle Bruckner, and she is asking, I love the phrase Black sanctity. Can the author speak more about this term?
So the term refers to thinking about the ways in which Blackness was made holy, or not made holy, but described as holy, integrated into a kind of discourse of holiness. So, and then intertwined with the sort of like the historical reality of Black saints, of individuals who were referred to as Black, who became saints. And so when I talk about Black sanctity, I'm talking about all of those together, the sort of the complexities of the ways people talked about Blackness and holiness together, and just the historical fact of that Black saints existed and that they were widely venerated and that they were really important to the Catholic Church. And some of the discourses of Black sanctity and representations of Black sanctity are really, in addition to, some of them are complicated and problematic, and some of them are extraordinarily beautiful and sort of deeply moving. And so that the phrase kind of encapsulates all of that.
Thank you. We have a question from Ellie Bennett. Ellie, do you want to turn on your mic and ask your question on video or just orally?
They put their question in the chat.
Yeah, he put, but I am asking myself because he has, okay, I think
Hi,
that
Erin. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you for such a wonderful overview. I really loved your book so much. I work on Black saints in Uganda in the 19th century, and I haven't come across any of the saints that you mention in your book, and I was just interested. It's probably a bit of a difficult question because your book does focus on the early modern period and Spanish and Portuguese missions, but I just wondered if you had noticed kind of the spread of these particular saints over into kind of French and British Catholic missions in different periods, or if that's something that might be of interest for the future.
I have not. So the answer is that I have not, and that I haven't noticed it, that I haven't looked into it, not that it didn't happen. It's hard to know what happens to the devotion to Black saints, because there are certain areas in Spain and Portugal, I think is a good example, where it kind of peters out in the 18th century, and other places where it stays really vibrant and important. And so, yeah, I don't know if missionaries are still using those Black saints as kind of ambassadors in a way of Catholicism to Black catechumens, to people that they're trying to convert. Especially in the English and French context. I don't know if the French missionaries in my period even ever looked at Black saints. They were always thought about, even though Benedict and Antonio are Sicilian, I don't know if they were ever talked about outside of Europe by anybody other than Spanish and Portuguese. So it's a really interesting question. Although somebody did reach out to me from Sicily. She was a French, actually, filmmaker who had been working on present day festivals celebrating Benedict of Palermo in Palermo by recent West African immigrants. And she had done this documentary about it. It was really, really, really interesting material. So I'm sure there's a lot more out there than what I know.
Thanks, Erin.
Thank you so much. Who is the next? Alex, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Erin, for this. This is a wonderful book. I really enjoyed it. I grew up Catholic, and I grew up in the Dominican Republic, where we still have cofradías, or at least they're called that way. And my question is about the connection between this past and the present today, because you see, my imagination, there is not such a break. As in the book, there's a suggestion that these kind of things fade away. But even by the same name and in the same form of practice, at least growing up in the Caribbean, I saw similar forms. So I was wondering if you could make some more connections to the present.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, it's very space dependent. So a lot of what, when I was thinking about things fading away, as I just mentioned a minute ago, I see that largely in the European context, where there's this vibrancy of devotion that just kind of disappears. And then now there's a kind of historical amnesia about the presence of well, sort of Black Iberia generally, but specifically about the saints themselves, even though they were extremely important through the 18th century. So trying to figure out, but that's very different than as you just mentioned, in the Caribbean, in lots of places in the Americas, where there is a sort of a direct connection of devotion, of the saints taking on kind of afterlives or new lives or different lives, and that tradition is much richer in a number of different spaces in the Americas than in Europe, which is what I meant which is kind of where I was mostly reflecting on this idea of kind of fading out in the 18th century, and part of it is just needing to end the book somewhere, because moving it forward, I love to see those resonances, and you can think about the festivals that they still have today. So Iphigenia is the patron saint of Afro-Peruvians, and so there are certain places where they celebrate her feast day every year, and as specifically as such. The image that they use is a more modern one, but you can see that, and of course, I think the meanings of the saints are always different from generation to generation, from place to place, but they have this kind of these very rich resonances that still persist today in many, many places.
Thank you, Erin. I don't know if I don't see any questions here. Then I will jump in for two questions to Erin. The first one, Erin, would be about the United States. Then, because the United States is a country that has about 50 million people who identify as Catholics. We have in the United States a significant population of African descent, if not numerically, then in terms of its political presence, that is the African American population. And we know that there are a number of African Americans who are Catholics. We know also, of course, about the Jesuits and their presence, and the fact that they own enslaved people, that this is an important feature. But we don't hear much about Black saints and their existence here in the United States. Then this perhaps is just me, that I am ignorant, but I would like you to comment that if this presence has been there in the past and was erased, if is being brought, for example, by new immigrants who are coming from Catholic countries of the Caribbean. That could be Haiti, Dominican Republic, as Alex, and then I don't know, Cuba, and so on. Then this would be one of the questions. And the other question is about the book cover. Then this saint, if you could talk a little bit more about this saint that you chose to put on the cover. I know the name of the saint, but I then also would like you to, because this is also in a patron saint that is very popular in a country that perhaps we do not think about as a country where we can find Black saints. Then I would like you to explore those two avenues.
So the United States, I think that's a great question. And I think the vast majority of Catholics, white and Black, that I've talked to have no idea that there were Black saints in this period. If people know about Black saints, they know about some of the more modern ones. And I can't believe I can't remember her name, but there's a Sudanese saint who I think lived in the 19th century. But they were always thinking kind of about more modern figures. But I don't know I know that there are churches and images dedicated both to Benedict of Palermo and also to Martin de Porres in the United States. Mm-hmm. So what I don't know is if, and just as a bracket, so Martin de Porres is a 17th century Afro-Peruvian Dominican. And I talk about him in the book, but I don't include him in the saint category because he's not beatified until the 19th century and canonized until the 20th century. He's a weird figure because he is a saint now, but he wasn't then, if that makes sense. So I know that those exist in the United States today, but I don't know very much about when these were introduced, when these, and what people's, both either white or Black Catholics, what their relationship to these saints is, if that makes sense. I know that there are places where there are parish churches named after Benedict of Palermo, although it's very common. There's one in New York City, actually in Manhattan, but it uses the sort of Italian version of what we call him, or what they call him, which is Benedict the Moor, which is not something that is ever used in Spanish or Portuguese. So I avoided in the book for that reason, because it creates all kinds of confusion. But so it is there in Manhattan. I thought, I was like, oh, Benedict the Moor. I don't know if people know that he's a Black saint, because it's such the name is so odd, and I don't know if there are images inside. So I think it's a really important question, and I never found anything that suggests that the same kind of richness of history, I guess, in the United States. But that doesn't mean for these saints. But of course, that doesn't mean that there wasn't. So the other part of that, so on the cover, that's, as they showed in the slide too, that's Benedict of Palermo. That image was probably part of a Franciscan convent. When it shut its doors, the image went to the museum. And so it's always sad for me when it's been decontextualized that way. Mm-hmm. But he is the 16th century Franciscan friar who was born of an enslaved mother. And there's a lot of controversy over whether or not he was born enslaved, but he lived his life as a free man. He was a hermit. So he was of the Franciscans when they were still kind of wandering around in the countryside, living this life of solitude. And then he was forced into a convent by some reforms that they were doing in the 16th century. But he very quickly got a reputation for holiness. And actually, 16th century Sicily is this really interesting place. There are like 5 Black holy people who are all Franciscans. And so that was kind of an interesting thing to think through. But he was the most, quote unquote, successful of that group of saints. And so he was associated with his mysticism, but of course also with his low status. And so that's one of, like, going back to this issue of Black sanctity. What does it mean? What are the things people associated with Blackness and Black saints? And in a lot of cases, it was humility. And so you have this, like, this strong association between triangulation between him, his particular life, humility, low station in life, and his Blackness. Of course, that's a nice contrast with the royal saints, where there's a different thing going on. So, and he is the most important of all the Black saints in terms of like his reach.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And then we have a question by Alessandra. Then let me see if I can find Alessandra's video to spotlight her. Yes, go ahead, Alessandra.
Hi, thank you very much, Erin, for your presentation this evening. I really enjoyed it. I have not had the opportunity to read your book yet, but the presence of Black saints in a number of the churches and monasteries that I have visited over time continues to intrigue how and why they arrived here. And so in your presentation, this was the first time I've heard about the direct link that you have made based on your archive, on your interrogation of the archives. You've made this direct link about the presence and activism of the confraternities and the veneration of Black saints. I wonder if you could comment a bit more on what is it that you're seeing in the archive that tells you they're directly associated. Is it that they have made provision to the churches, or is it that the members are actively sculpting and creating these images? Are you seeing provision of funds for that purpose? And indeed, who might have been, at least at that beginning stage, who were the ones who were sculpting or producing these first images? Thank you.
Yes, so what I saw in the archives were, so people would get permission to establish a confraternity. And so, but they're not, people aren't forced into them, if that makes sense. They are, at least in theory, the result of kind of spontaneous devotion. Now, I think in the very beginning, Franciscans in particular did a lot of organizing confraternities and encouraging particularly newly enslaved people into joining them. But we see a lot of self-directed creation of confraternities. And I think for a variety of reasons, partially because, or maybe even largely because, confraternities supported each other both spiritually, but also emotionally and financially. So one of the things they do is occasionally they raise money to free each other. So they're kind of spaces of outside the white gaze for the most part. But so we can see them setting up their confraternities, but the role that Black saints play in them is hard to tease out, because there are some references in wills, and there are some confraternities that are actually dedicated to Black saints. So that's pretty straightforward. And sometimes they'll say, this is why we chose this saint. Usually it's nothing more than what I mentioned earlier, which is we are devoted to him because he is Black like us, or he's the same color that we are, without kind of articulating further about him. But actually one of the main ways we see them is through surviving altars, confraternity altars, because often the main patron saint of a confraternity was a Virgin Mary, and you wouldn't tell from the documents that there were other Black saints in their collection. Sometimes there are inventories that survive, and sometimes there aren't, but we can really see it most vividly actually in the visual archive rather than the documentary. Unfortunately, we don't know the artists in most of those cases. I would not be surprised in any way, shape, or form in some cases if it is the members themselves who are doing some sculpting. Absolutely. And we know, I know that the Iberian side better, but there are, Black artists and sculptors in the early modern period. The only one that I'm almost 100% sure was done by Black artists in the book is this watercolor drawing of Antonio Donato holding the baby Jesus in his arms. That's from a collection at the Oliveira Lima Library at Catholic University, and they did this beautiful watercolor edition of their statutes for their organization, for their confraternity, and this beautiful watercolor is included in it. But it's very difficult even to figure out who commissioned them, where they came from. You sometimes will find like contracts with artists to commission a specific image, but they're not easy to find, and especially for these ones that aren't coming from like famous artist workshops, it gets frustrating really quickly. I feel like there was a second question and I didn't answer it because I got caught up in the image question. Can you remind me?
I think you covered most of what I was seeking. It was, I think, a little bit more on when you went to the archive. How did you arrive at the confraternities? How did they jump out at you to say, oh, here's this connection, you know?
Yes, so it was, now I'm trying to figure out how I first got to confraternities. And actually, I think the first confraternity that I ever did any research about, or that ever came to my attention, was the Brotherhood of Nuestra Señora de los Ángeles in Seville. And that's a very famous one. It's referred to as Los Negritos today. That's what it's called. It was a very famous and a very important and reasonably wealthy Black confraternity in Seville in the 16th and 17th century. And it eventually gets taken over by white Sevillanos. And it's still a really important confraternity today. People know in Seville, they love their confraternities. They're really important. And so they still have the old chapel and a huge archive, which is not typical. And I didn't work in the archive because a lot of that scholarship was done by a local civilian scholar, and who wrote a really important book about the confraternity and its history. So that's when I first started, oh, that's a thing. And then I started kind of looking for them more. And then I found, other scholars had worked on Black confraternities, particularly in the Americas, for several decades. And then, so then it was like, oh, look, there's literature about this here and this here and this here. And then I was trying to like, okay, how is there a way that we can zoom out and connect some of these dots?
Thank you. Let's see if you have. Thank you, Alessandra. Let's see if we have more questions here. Okay. I see that there is some conversation in the chat. Perhaps, Alexandra, you could bring some of your ideas, because we have this conversation in the chat and we don't have much questions here.
Yeah.
Nobody else is, then anybody else who wants to? Okay, there is the Alexandra, she's bringing the presence of this, then the issue of this St. Benedict the Moor in Washington, D.C., that there is a church founded in the 1940s. Apparently this is still there, then from what I know, but I never been there. Alex is bringing the story of Madonna in her video that included San Martin de Porres, like a prayer, and so on. And Alexandra, she's also bringing that the confraternity as far participants visited during the 2017 conference. Okay, we have Khaled who has a question. Then you can just unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erin. Thank you for that wonderful, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, thank you for that wonderful presentation. I must say I haven't read the book, but I ordered the book, so I can't wait to start reading it. My question is, I work on Saharan Muslim enslaved African Saharan Sufi saints. And this is very refreshing to me to read, to hear your presentation. But I'm wondering is how do these individuals that you're looking at, this Black saint, how do they reconcile, you know, their faith with slavery and with the society that was predominantly racist? So how do they, are there any records, you know, that tell us about their, how do they go about reconciling the two? Thank you.
How the saints themselves?
Yes, the saints themselves reconcile the question of slavery and racism. So that's a
wonderful question. And it's a really difficult thing to access because so many of the source material that we have are these hagiographies, which are, you know, sometimes they include input from the saints, and a lot of times they don't. But even when they do, you're not really going to see a lot of like obvious reflecting on that. So but you can do a little bit of reading against the grain. I mean, I think the best text to read, which is available in English, it's relatively cheap paperback that I highly encourage everyone to run out and get and teach in their classrooms and read, is the Spiritual Diary of Ursula de Jesus, who was a 17th century nun or tertiary in Lima. And she kept it, she was so renowned for her visions and her holiness, she was instructed to keep a diary. She probably she spoke it orally and somebody wrote it down. But there's lots of she's very frank in the diary about her relationship with the racist nuns and how mean they are to her. And she's always talking to God, like, how am I going to deal with this? But it's because she is deeply devout and meshed in her own, you know, love of God. There's no sort of critique of Christ, right? So, but there is a critique of the church that shows up in a bunch of different ways. So she complains about nuns. She also has visions of nuns in hell, lots of them. And you could kind of see and she's talking to God about it. Like, they treat me so badly. What do I do about it? And Jesus says to her, and Francis of Assisi says to her, well, you're like us, because we were maligned and we suffered because of the mistreatment by other people. And the people that think that they are better, that think that they are higher, are the ones that are lost. They're sinful. And you're with us. You're with us. And you should just be like reconciled to that in that relationship. And I think that it's an interesting thing, because that's what I see in all the hagiography. That's what the clergy are saying, you know, but you also see it showing up by Black holy people themselves, which suggests that to some people anyway, there was a kind of deep theological meaning and truth in that idea that was very prominent in how people understood the idea of Black sanctity and Black sort of spirituality. This connection of dispossession, but also promises of eternal reward for their suffering, right? Because in Catholicism, you're suffering like it pays off, right? And that you get a better place in purgatory or in heaven the more you suffer in life.
Thank you so much, Erin. Thank you, Khaled. Now we have a question from Alexandra, then I will add you. Here we go.
Well, first, thank you so much for your work. I've been immersed inside of this book and your work on Santiago de Compostela, because I work in Santiago de Cuba, where this is very prevalent. And one of the things I've been grappling with for several years now, until your book was published, has been the presence of San Benito de Palermo as a representative saint for one of the Cabildo de los Congos clusters founded in 1616. So I've been trying to figure out, this seemingly short time period of the dispersion of San Benito de Palermo. And I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit more about that early circularity of his life, his ideas, to kind of help me make sense of that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great, complicated thing to think about. So like, it's very difficult, it's very challenging to trace the movement of devotions, and which is one of the reasons, again, that objects are so useful. But yes, so it's fascinating, exactly as you say, how quickly it takes off. So often with saints, they're like, people, it can be like a slow burn, like a saint doesn't usually just like explode into popularity the way Benedict does during this period. And of course, his case is even more weird because he's not a saint, but he's treated like a saint. So what we know is in the very early 17th century, so Sicily is part of the Spanish monarchy. And they start writing to Philip III saying, oh, there's this great holy man and give us donations and we want to have him canonized. And Philip is like, that sounds awesome, let's do that. And he gives all this money. And so the Franciscans are really, especially the Sicilian Franciscans, they're coming to Spain, they're talking him up. And immediately everybody seems really taken by this idea, by this saint, by this individual. And so like Lope de Vega is producing plays about blank 16, 17, getting really fast. So Benedict of Palermo died, 1589? And that's really fast. And what the letters say is that Philip gets sent a relic. And that at the same time that a relic is sent to Spain, there's one sent to, quote, the Indies, so probably the Caribbean. But we don't have any idea, more specifically than that, where it was sent. But we do know, the Black confraternity dedicated to Benedict in Puebla is founded around that same time. So by 1620, there are already Black confraternities dedicated to him in the Americas. And this is extraordinarily wide dispersal very quickly, which is very difficult to follow on a very granular level. It's easier to see once you kind of telescope out, but it speaks to something really extraordinary happening during this time period and evolving around this one figure.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Alexandra. Do we have more questions or comments?
If nobody has a question, I think I want to.
Do you want to jump in?
Jump in, yeah. Because I mean, to me, one of the things that was good about this book and very subtle was the ways in which it actually intervened into that space between Iberian studies and African studies without making, a big deal about it. And I know from the Iberian studies side of the house, and was recently at the Iberian Connections club that is run out of, series that is run out of Yale. I was just there recently. And I know that they're kind of like, struggling in that, initial step to try to make overtures towards African studies, towards Black Atlantic studies, right? And they want to, and trying to figure out how to do that. But I think this book kind of subtly accomplishes sort of that integration of the two. You do delve into African history, African scholarship, as you're doing this, while focusing on on Iberia and the Iberian Empire. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about, from the multidisciplinary point of view, like as a sort of disciplinary positioning, if you were conscious as you were doing this, and how do you see these possible futures for these kind of intersections to happen more and more?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny because I think I was not having a metadisciplinary conversation with myself as I was putting these pieces together. I was really sort of like in the weeds, in this sense of like, with my historian hat on, just really trying to understand how these different pieces are related to each other, and trying to sort of pushing really hard against any kind of unconscious and conscious sort of Europeanist blinders, right? Okay, how do I think about about movement, about all these different sites. What are all the things that I need to be thinking about simultaneously? And you could see my bibliography got bigger and bigger and bigger as I tried to kind of do everything. And I felt very self-consciously about it, actually, because I think one of the things that can be really challenging for people as they move into other historiographies is worrying about being too superficial to other people's disciplines, right? So I was like, oh, okay, now I want to. So I had the part where I was just doing the work and trying to make the connections. And then my metadisciplinary reflection was actually, I felt a lot of anxiety about it. Like I wanted to make connections that I thought would be useful to scholars in different fields, while simultaneously trying to be very clear in my own work about my reliance on scholars, of experts in those fields, and not trying to position myself as an expert, but as trying to make connections to these conversations that I saw all talking to each other in really important ways. So I saw myself as like a kind of a facilitator of conversations, I guess, if that makes sense. But it is challenging, for sure. Historiographically, in a whole bunch of ways. But thank you for that observation. That was really gratifying to hear your reaction to it that way.
No, thank you for making those connections in the book in a way that opens up, the Black Atlantic to the Iberian Empire in ways that we are used to seeing them in the Francophone world and the Anglophone world, but we're not used to seeing that opening. And the key was the church, right? A deeply religious culture, a culture of devotion that is attached to empire. And you did a great job of bringing that up. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say really quickly that I had always thought about this as the book, because I knew I couldn't get into all of the different complexities of these different regional specific cases and historiographies. I really thought of this project as forging connections, of starting a conversation, of trying to help scholars in these areas see or understand like the history of things, or where things came from, or who this saint is if they come across them, or how these things might be related to each other in ways that I hoped would be useful to other scholars, rather than, so I thought of it as like a starting off point, rather than, sometimes I think people feel and do write books that are like, this is the definitive book on X subject. And I was never trying to write a definitive book on X subject. I was trying to start a conversation about these connections. And, I was thinking a lot about Roque Ferreira's work and about the movement of sacred art between Angola and Brazil, and thought about that there might be more to do there if we could kind of find out more about Black saints and if images are being traded across the Atlantic from those two sites.
Thank you, Erin. I don't know, Vanessa, do you have a question, or do you want me to go with the chat? The question in the chat.
Yeah, I was going to say there is a question down in the chat if you want to do that first.
Okay, then you can go. Okay, folks, we have a question from Vanicleia Santos, who is a Brazilian historian, and he covers Africa. The question is, then she's asking a question, and I will have something to add to that as well, because it's related. She says, okay, could you talk a little bit more about the question of the artists who made the Black saints that you analyzed? Then this is her question. My question would be a little bit related to this and to what Alex asked previously, which is the encounter. Then first he was focusing more on the Black Atlantic and the idea, and also the connections with Africa. But I think in terms of other disciplines that you are covering, that you are somewhat in dialogue here in your work, then as a historian, you are examining images and material culture that require, then this kind of study requires from you then tools that usually historians, they are not worried about than that is to analyze visual images. Then I would like you to explore a little bit how was this work, how you connected this interest in Catholicism to this kind of work that requires you to analyze sources that are not written sources, and to which extent this kind of expansion of your work was well received or not by historians who are usually not familiar with that.
Oh my. So just to first, I'll say, in most cases, we don't know very much about the artists that are involved in the production of images. Like if you think about like the thousands and thousands of devotional objects that were produced, even in just like early modern Spain, the majority of which were sculpture, we don't know very much about them. A couple of the images of Benedict of Palermo, including the one that's in Detroit, are from the workshops of well-known artists, or that are attributed to them. So we do know in some cases that where they came from, or people have a guess. But in most cases, we don't know, and we don't know anything about the artists. And I think if I was an art historian, it might be once I got deeper into some of these places, I might be able to, every once in a while you get lucky and you could find like a commission, or if I understood how the artistic workshops in a specific area worked, I'd get a better sense of like who might be receiving those commissions. But I have to say, like, this is a huge generalization, so I apologize immediately to any art historians in the audience. But there still is the preponderance of scholarship, again, huge generalization, has been traditionally on like what we call like the masters, right? The people that are recognized as being quote unquote important artists, and less on the sort of more ordinary art that's considered of less artistic value, right? So if you read these like guides to art in Spanish churches that I poured through for this book, they're always like, oh yes, and there are other things in this church that are of no artistic merit. And you're like, okay, that's an interesting way of sort of, that's often the way things are kind of divided. So we know a lot less of the things that weren't considered artistically important. And so it was very intimidating, I'll have to say, to kind of walk into this world of, not of visual culture necessarily, because I've been thinking with images, particularly engravings, for a while, and had been really engaged in historians who work really well with images and also with art historians. So I knew that I was eager to kind of go there, work really with images, but I was not prepared for the sort of level of my own ignorance, really, from a disciplinary perspective. What are the questions that I need to ask of this image? So I actually sat down with art historians and with grad school students particularly, and I asked them, what do I need to ask? Of what, when I look at this sculpture, what are the questions that I need to ask about them? And one of the most frustrating things is that because so few of these Black sculptures have been studied, or particularly from like a material perspective, we don't know things like the kinds of pigments that were used. And it was very difficult for me to figure out when things were conserved, like when they had been, so if we're talking about pigments, were the pigments touched up? Because clearly in many cases, they've been sort of like repainted more recently. And so I really was doing a lot of teaching myself and asking questions, that trying to figure out from like the most basic level, what are the things that I need to think about from a material perspective when analyzing these objects, and just doing a lot of reading from art historians. But it was intimidating. I have to say, like, the thing that I learned most from this project was to just sort of like not just jump in and try to do it and see if you're able to, I was like, oh, I've never been to Portugal. Okay, I'm just going to go and we're going to see how this works out. And I'm going to expand my geographies and chronologies and all these different ways. And we'll see if I can try to just do it the best way that I can. But I haven't heard back from anybody, art historians or historians, with a critique of the way that I read and use and understand the images. That doesn't mean that there isn't any. I just haven't heard back yet about it.
Thank you so much, Erin. And I would have then one last question. We don't have any more questions in the chat. You have one. Go ahead, please.
That's sort of along the lines of what you were just talking about. So when you gave us some images, both of sculpture and then I guess it was an engraving that you showed us, I wondered first about what features artists are emphasizing. You know, these are supposed to be visual representations of the sacred, and so they're kind of, it's not, there's no detail, you know, that's missed, and they're not necessarily meant to be realistic so much as super symbolic. And so I wondered, you know, what early moderns are reading into the features that these sculptures have. I think the feature that is certainly, you know, really central to your cover is hair. And I sort of wonder, you know, for a group of people who are a few generations from Moorish rule, what it means to then have hair like that exalted to saintly status. And I also wonder, in the modern, you know, in our contemporary period, there are sort of remnants of areas where these statues still exist. They're still in altars. And you mentioned that in the present day, there are situations where you encounter people who are attending churches with these with these images, but they don't, I think the turn or phrase you use is they don't see these saints as Black, or they don't think of them as Black, even though at least now, after certainly 19th century taxonomies have acculturated everyone to think about features in particular ways, it seems very odd to me that Blackness wouldn't be red. So it's really a two-part question.
Yeah, it's hard for me to know if just to start with the second one, where that denial comes from. So I think in some cases, there's a way that people are today or in the last century kind of reading the Blackness as a spiritual attribute. So reading a Black saint as in a similar way to one might read the Black Madonna. So the Blackness kind of representing some aspect of the saint's iconography rather than their sort of being, you know, of African origin or descent. So they're not Black, they're just Black, if that makes sense. So there's definitely some of that, I think, and I don't know what the rest of it is. It's very strange to have the experience over and over again of people just really being insistent. There's no Black saint in there. And so for a while, I used this very tortured language of, he's a Franciscan saint who's sometimes represented or painted Black. Sometimes that was more helpful. But actually the most helpful thing was to show them if I had a picture of what I was looking for from another source, then sometimes that helped. But it was a really odd. I spent a lot of time looking at hair, I will say. I looked at a lot of things really carefully when I was trying to understand. So when I was thinking about the Encarnaciones, I was thinking when I was trying to understand about one of the most important things about the way that flesh tones are painted on polychrome sculpture is they're incredibly, like, the detail of them are incredible. So like you'll have a vein, they'll have a vein that's popping that with the blue in it, and you can see that in the sculpture. They're done meticulously. So when you have a monochrome Blackness, that, like, how do they then create that detail, that lifelikeness? And so one of the arguments that I had is they put it into some of the sculptural features, particularly the hair. There's an incredible variety of hair, and I would say in so many of the cases the hair has extraordinary charisma, and that's true frequently of white saints also. But the hair, the patterns of hair in Black saints is different from white saints, even though a lot of white saints have very wavy hair. I looked at, none of them have the same kind of, like, the tight curls or the same Some of them have like big waves, like they just are different from the way that white saints' hair is represented. So there's something, the artists are making a statement about the distinctiveness of the saint through their hair, very deliberately, I think. And so I thought that the detail on that particular sculpture was, and the way that it was lit was particularly beautiful, but it's not, that's not the only kind of example of it like that. So they are, the blackness itself and their like black bodies are clearly really important to the people who are creating the images, and I think to white hagiographers as well. So going back to the question about what does black sanctity mean? I think it's very, well, all sanctity in the Catholic Church is embodied. And I think there isn't an effort to disembody the black saints from you know, they're not trying to sort of, oh, we're only going to celebrate the white interior in an image. They go hard the other direction. And they're saying, their blackness is key to their sanctity. And it is all tied into those discourses that I mentioned at the very beginning, where the lowest become the highest, where it's coded with humility, with penance, with all these sort of, and as a way of demonstrating not the worthlessness of the saint or of Black Catholics, but of their ability to stand even more greatly than whites, because there's that inversion. The worse you're treated, the closer you are to God. And so they're trying to have that, to make all of that legible in those images.
Thank you, Erin. And I would have just one short last question. What is the project that you are working now, then the next one?
Well, I have a couple of things. None of them are big, because I had this, you know, I sunk so, it was a really intense process writing this book. And when it was done, I felt really invigorated, but I didn't want to do one big thing. I wanted to be able to kind of go in a bunch of different directions simultaneously. So I'm still interested in, actually, I would really like to do a large scale collaborative process that would allow a digital humanities project that would allow the collection or creation of a visual archive of images of Black saints from globally. So that's one thing that's sort of always on my radar. And then I have these other smaller projects that I'm interested in. One has nothing to do with any of the things we've been talking about, which is on the Sacred Heart and images of the Sacred Heart, which I got into because there's so many images of Benedicto Palermo with the Sacred Heart. And I started getting interested in it from a history of science and history of emotion perspective. But I also am interested in some anti-slavery discourses, kind of picking back up some of the story that I tell in the book about this moment in the 1680s at the Propaganda Fide, where you have Lorenzo de Mendoza coming and complaining about the treatment of baptized Christians, of enslaved Christians. And at the same time, there are these one French and one Spanish Capuchin from the Caribbean who are arrested in the Caribbean for refusing to give communion to enslavers, because they view them as committing a mortal sin, and because they have not repented, they can't have communion. And they get arrested and imprisoned in Cuba and then sent to Spain. Anyway, they are also in the Propaganda Fide at the same moment. So I'm kind of thinking about what's happening in terms of critiques of slavery in the kind of Catholic Atlantic in the 1680s. And I'm also interested in, I'm still doing some work on Teresa Juliana de Santo Domingo. She's really interesting, and the ways in which people are kind of triangulating the figure of like the evil Turk with the pagan African, and like in the race to be like, who could be potentially the best Christians. So those are a couple of the little things that I'm working on, as well as some other things.
Thank you, Dan. This is great. And you are going to end here And I would like then to thank Erin for this presentation. And I just want to emphasize once more that the book that that we read is Black Saints in Early Modern Global Catholicism by Rowe. And this is a book that was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. And just to let you know that this book already won 2 prizes this year. The Roland Benton Prize by 16th Century Studies, 2020, and also the Albert Outler Prize by the American Society of Church History. Then this is just one of the books that has been getting prizes that we discussed here in the Slaveryarchive Book Club. Several others are either shortlisted, others already that you are going to discuss next year. They also received, were either nominated or received prizes. Then thank you so much, Erin, for your wonderful work. I hope that those of you who didn't read the book, that you get the book and read it and assign the book and so on. We're going to have another book by Carmen Fracchia, Black But Human, that you are going to discuss next year, that is related to this book as well. Then about representations of slavery in the Iberian Peninsula. And I want to thank my co-hosts here that are Alex and Vanessa. Thank you so much for the wonderful work. And next week, yes, this is very important. Then next Wednesday, I will be discussing my own book here. And I hope that some of you will have some energy to show up. Otherwise, thank you so much, folks, for coming. And you know that how can I say, the video on YouTube is going to be there with all those things in the beginning that you always have. But this is part of the COVID-19 video culture that we have always people, I can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself and all these things. At some point, all this will be ended. Meanwhile, stay healthy and safe. And I hope to see you in the next one. And you have also then November 21st, another book by Manuel Barcia that is going to be on a Saturday. And then December 15, we have the book by Rick Bell as well. And then restart in January with several other books. Thank you, folks. Stay safe.
So
bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye all.